Good morning, church, and welcome to this. You may notice I'm not actually in our church facility, but we are still having church, and that's something to take note of. I'm outside, it's beautiful, I love it, in the midst of God's creation, and I'm recording a sermon, and this is a little new for me, so I hope you'll bear with me. This is a little different. I'm very used to you guys being there, not this camera thing in my face. I'm much more used to the congregation of church members responding to the things I say and do, and this is different. But that's okay. It's timely, in fact. It's significant, especially since we are approaching a chapter in the book we've been reading, 1 Corinthians. We're in chapter 8 and 9 today. We're approaching a chapter that touches on something that might be a little close to home, especially with our current circumstances, what we're dealing with in life. So join with me this morning, wherever you may be. Today, you gathering in your location, whether it's in your living room, on the couch, at a friend's house, wherever you may be, today, this is what it looks like to not just go to a church facility, but to be the church. It's going to be different, it's going to be a little unique, and you're going to hear dogs barking apparently. Let's do it. Now, before we get too ahead of ourselves, there's a couple things to note. While this situation unfolds, bear in mind we will do our best to update you with what we plan to do week to week with this church via digital gathering routine. We foresee it lasting probably for the next 5 or 6 weeks. We will keep you up to date. So that means Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights and any other Thursday night or Saturday morning gathering is temporarily canceled for the sake of precautionary measures of social distancing. We're the church. We don't know how to do that very well. Every time we gather, we're shaking hands, hugging, sharing a meal, sometimes even just sharing, germs. Let's be real. We share germs a lot too. If someone gets the flu, then it's only a week or two before the person in the row in front of them gets it as well. And that's not something we want to happen with this COVID-19 coronavirus thing. Still, it's a fun opportunity if you ask me. It's a fun opportunity to remind ourselves that we often get stuck in a rut. We get used to doing the same thing over and over and over again. And this is something Paul is perhaps trying to address with the church in Corinth. And it also might be something that's just as appropriate for us today to think through, given our present circumstances. So let's dive in. If you're like me, you might have one of these things. We could call that the analog version of the Bible, the one with pages and stuff like that. And if it helps you, 1 Corinthians chapter 8 is on page 1449 in the Wesleyan Study Bible, Common English Bible version. That's what I'll be reading from this morning. But if you are tech savvy and you have the Bible app, then I would ask that you pause the video right now, open the app, go to the events thing. Actually, don't pause it right now. Let me get the instructions out of the way. Go to the more and then events sections in that menu, and you're going to have to search for Shelton Church of the Nazarene because normally it would GPS locate you because you were at our physical address. But now we get to play ball in a different way. But again, this might be a good thing. So, pause the video, get your Bibles ready, and when you are ready, hit play again on whatever device you are watching this on. I'll wait. Okay, are you ready? For sure? For real? Make sure everyone has everything ready to go. Okay, let's get started. If you need help, I'm going to put the words on the screen. First things first, let's talk about context. Paul, the guy we see in this icon, wrote this letter to the people gathering in Corinth, the church in Corinth, to remind them of who Christ is and who they say they believe they are following. Now, Corinth was a location that was a trade hub, a cultural hub, And because of this, there was a lot going on, a lot of distractions from these folk who were gathering together, trying to recall and remember and follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. Some of the specific things Paul has called on them to correct, to address, to remember is unchristlike would be issues of division, where one would say they follow Paul and another Apollos, which doesn't sound a whole lot different than Christians living in America today. We follow a lot of different people and sometimes forget about that Jesus guy. He also talks about issues of sex and just simply what we do with our bodies and how it matters, because our physical body is connected to this physical church, because our physical and spiritual beings, they have a deep connection and one affects the other. And now Paul is going to touch on something that's really significant, especially for us today. It is so timely. It is so incredibly important for us to wrestle with today. It's the concept of self-sacrifice. Now, Paul's going to talk specifically about food, but it's timely and important for us to wrestle with because today we are self-sacrificing our normal mode of operation. So let's get to it. Let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. Now concerning meat that has been sacrificed to a false god, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes people arrogant, but love builds up. If anyone thinks they know something, they don't yet know as much as they should know. But if someone loves God, then they are known by God. So concerning the actual food involved in these sacrifices to false gods, we know that a false god isn't anything in this world, and that there is no God except for the one God. Granted, there are so-called gods in heaven and on the earth, as there are many gods and many lords. However, for us believers, there is one God the Father. All things come from him, and we belong to him. And there is one Lord, Jesus Christ. All things exist through him, and we live through him. But not everybody knows this. Some are eating this food as though it really is food sacrificed to a real idol because they were used to idol worship until now. Their conscience is weak because it has been damaged. Food won't bring us close to God. We're not missing out if we don't eat, and we don't have any advantage if we do eat. But watch out, or else this freedom of yours might be a problem for those who are weak. Suppose someone sees you, the person who has knowledge, you are the person with knowledge is what Paul is saying, eating in an idol's temple. Won't the person with a weak conscience be encouraged to eat the meat sacrificed to false gods? The weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. You sin against Christ if you sin against this brother and sister and hurt their weak conscience this way. This is why, if food causes the downfall of my brother or sister, I won't eat meat ever again, or else I may cause my brother or sister to fall. I know. I'm inside now. I'm sorry if this is distracting. This is new for me too. Back to Paul. Did he just say we need to be vegetarians? Sort of. I mean, no, but he kind of did. He is assuming that these people who are self-proclaimed Christ followers know better. And that if they do know better, which they should, since not a couple chapters back he said you should be eating solid food, not milk like a baby, that what they do matters, especially if it negatively affects somebody else. It's interesting, especially today. We made a decision out of love to sacrifice, to not gather together, to not increase the odds of spreading this virus that people don't want to catch. And a lot of people have a lot of opinions and feelings on that. It's become very politicized. It's become this big thing that is yet another divisive thing. And I would have to assume if Paul wrote a letter to us today in this country at this time, he would add yet again another instance of, hey, remember how you were divided on whether or not you should have done this or that with the coronavirus? We still don't learn, do we? So for a moment, though, consider what Paul is actually saying. At the time, the food sacrifice to idol thing was a regular issue that these people faced. They had to buy their food in the marketplace, and sometimes the meat that was available was meat that had actually been sacrificed to some idol, some pagan god in that town. And people could see that. It was well known that there were certain meats that were sacrificed to idols and there were other meats that weren't. And Paul is basically saying, yeah, sure, it's just meat. We get it. That's just like a wooden statue thing. We don't have to worry about that. But to some people, that's a big deal. So what Paul's actually saying is you need to empathize with somebody else who doesn't agree with you. And that you, the person with knowledge, you need to lead by example. You need to self-sacrifice in a way that doesn't cause someone else to stumble. But that's not something we regularly do, is it? And that's something that maybe it convicts us a little bit, and maybe we would rather gloss over chapters like this one. But it gets better. Let's continue with chapter 9. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Haven't I seen Jesus our Lord? Aren't you my work in the Lord? If I'm not an apostle to others, at least I am to you. You are the seal that shows I am a disciple. This is my defense against those who criticize me. Don't we have the right to eat and drink? Don't we have the right to travel with a wife who believes like the rest of the apostles, the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who don't have the right to not work for our living? Who joins the army and pays their own way? Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat its fruit? Who shepherds a flock and doesn't drink its milk? I'm not saying these things just based on common sense, am I? Doesn't the law itself say these things? In Moses' law it is written, you will not muzzle the ox when it is threshing. Is God worried about oxen, or did he say this entirely for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the one who plows and the one who threshes should each do so with the hope of sharing the produce. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it so much to ask to harvest some material things from you? If others have these rights over you, don't we deserve them all the more? However, we haven't made use of this right. But we put up with everything, so we don't put any obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get to eat from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share part of what is sacrificed on the altar? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who preach the gospel should get their living from the gospel. But I haven't taken advantage of this, and I'm not writing this so that it will be done for me. It's better for me to die than to lose my right to brag about this. If I preach the gospel, I have no reason to brag, since I am obligated to do it. I'm in trouble if I don't preach the gospel. If I do this voluntarily, I get rewarded for it. But if I'm forced to do it, then I've been charged with a responsibility. What reward do I get? That when I preach, I offer the good news free of charge. That's why I don't use the rights to which I am entitled through the gospel. Is it me, or did it seem like Paul kind of went on a rant there for a second? There's a lot to discuss here, but we'll briefly touch on a couple things that are really important. Paul jumps from talking about food, which for a lot of us is a big deal. We really like our food. Giving up meat, that's a scary thing. It might be sweating. Maybe we have meat sweats. We're worried about having. That was a really cheesy dad joke. Anyways, truly, Paul goes from saying something about being a vegetarian to talking about working for free. And there's one common thread with it. Paul is essentially saying, I can eat meat, but if it causes someone else to stumble, then I will go without. I will self-sacrifice for the sake of another. In the same way, as a minister of the gospel, as an apostle, as someone who is teaching and discipling these churches, he could require payment. He could be supported financially from these ministries that he has helped start and shape and mold. But he goes without. And it's for the sake of the gospel. It is out of a desire to self-sacrificially love those that he is ministering to. And then Paul goes on. Although I am free from all people, I make myself a slave to all people to recruit more of them. I act like a Jew to the Jews so I can recruit Jews. I act like I'm under the law to those under the law so that I can recruit those who are under the law, though I myself am not under the law. I act like I'm outside the law to those who are outside the law, so I can recruit those outside the law, though I'm not outside the law of God, but rather under the law of Christ. I act weak to the weak, so I can recruit the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that I could save some by all possible means. All the things I do are for the sake of the gospel, so I can be a partner with it. Don't you know that all the runners in the stadium run, but only one gets the prize? So run to win. Everyone who competes practices self-discipline in everything. The runners do this to get a crown of leaves that shrivel up and die, but we do it to receive a crown that never dies. So now this is how I run, not without a clear goal in sight. I fight like a boxer in the ring, not like someone who is shadowboxing. Rather, I'm landing punches on my own body and subduing it like a slave. I do this to be sure that I myself won't be disqualified after preaching to others. Now, what Paul is talking about here is radical. He is talking about being all things to all people, and it might sound like he wants to be this masquerader, putting on masks, disguising who he really is, but he makes some very important and crucial points. He says that he himself is under the law of Christ, that he's modeling who Jesus calls him to be, that he is sacrificing his own identity so that others may know who Christ is, that truly he is putting others first, that he is practicing in a very real and significant way sacrificial love. He is saying that he is willing to be who other people need him to be so that they may know who Jesus is. I think sometimes we do the opposite. We expect others to be the way we think they should be. We expect others to live up to a certain bar, a certain standard, a certain ethic, a certain moral. And we do that to people that don't even necessarily subscribe to the same belief systems that we hold, the same beliefs that we have. Paul is calling us to something different, and it's so significant today, especially for us to consider what he is saying. All too often, we can hold something so tight in our hands and we can think that it's the most important thing. And someone may ask us why we are holding on to that thing so tightly. And maybe just the question of why offends us. Maybe it bothers us. Maybe we think, what are you talking about? Why would you even ask that? But Paul is saying, maybe we should try some humility and empathy for the sake of the gospel. That perhaps we should deny ourselves and humbly take up our cross daily and follow Jesus. That maybe sometimes it looks like not always doing it the way that we selfishly want things to be done. And practically speaking, maybe that's very poignant for us today. Maybe it would be a lot easier to just meet in a building with 4 walls, meet at an address we're very comfortable meeting in, that we're really used to going to. Maybe we're so comfortable with it that we have forgotten that that doesn't define what church is. And this whole chapter from Paul, these 2 chapters in fact from Paul, are very convicting because they're forcing us to think about the things that maybe we should be willing to let go for the sake of the gospel. Now, church family, I would ask you today to consider very practically things that you can do to sacrificially love others well. That if you are supposedly a person with knowledge, as Paul alludes to, and I say supposedly because Paul is speaking a little tongue-in-cheek, he may or may not have chastised this church for being less than mature enough. He expected more of them, and they're not living up to what he is hoping they would be at as far as their spiritual walk to this point. But we as the church, we as followers of Jesus, have a certain level of expectation we should hold ourselves to. That if we are to be like Christ, that if we are to be part of this kingdom building exercise, that if we're part of this work of pairing and partnering with Christ, which is what Paul says over and over again in this letter, we need to take seriously these things that Paul is saying, these things that are a callback to who Jesus is. Once again, I cannot focus on it enough. I cannot remind us enough. I cannot say it enough. There are some very basic tenets to this following Jesus Christian faith that we must take very seriously. Treating others the way we want to be treated, loving God with our absolute everything, as well as our neighbor as ourselves, are core and central to this thing. And Paul is making it very practical, very personal, and very basic by asking us very hard but simple questions like, would you be willing to become a vegetarian if it meant someone may know Jesus better? What about your pay? Would you be willing to work even if it wasn't for monetary gain so that others may come to know Christ? What about your identity? Would you be willing to put aside human labels, human identities, things that are human constructs for the sake of letting others feel valued and cared about and empathized with, so that others who maybe have a different perspective, different opinion, different idea about things may come to know that they are loved by the Creator of the universe because you chose to be humble enough to be used by God? These are times for questions to be asked. There are lots of interesting things happening, and now more than ever, it is important to remember what our faith is about, because that is what defines us. We're not defined by meeting at a time and in a place. We're defined by who we follow, and His name is Jesus, and He calls us to live a certain lifestyle. This is what Paul is also calling us back to. This is what Paul is echoing in this letter to the church. And today, as you're sitting there, maybe on your couch, maybe at a friend's house or in a coffee shop or who knows where, there are a couple things that I want you to process and think about with me. One, when you gather in the name of Jesus, when you gather together, you are not just going to church, but you are the church. Two, these are times to wrestle with our faith. That these are times to really reflect, to look inwards, to process our feelings and emotions about what is happening, but to also turn back in faith to a God who cares, who loves, who does not give us a spirit of fear, but of boldness. And finally, I would ask a question that it's a little convicting. The question is simple. Do you have something in your life that maybe you need to let go of because it's causing someone else to stumble? Is there something about you that you are just holding on to so tightly that it's affecting others in a negative way and potentially even preventing them from knowing this amazing person that you have a relationship with named Jesus? If that's the case, I think Paul makes it clear you need to be willing to let that go. Now, I know generally if we were gathered together on a Sunday morning, I would pray, and then we would sing another song, and then there would be a benediction. But I want to do something a little bit differently. Once this video ends, I would challenge you, wherever you are, to pray together. To pray that God would make it clear the things that we need to discern so that we can be the church that Jesus has called us to be, so that we can partner with Christ. I would challenge you to gather together and discuss these passages, to go over them and share with one another what spoke to you, what challenged you, what bothered you. And I would challenge you to do what the early church did in a very real way. In Acts chapter 2, after Pentecost, it says they are known by gathering together, by fellowshipping, eating, we love that, praying, and studying the Word. So today, church, in a bold, brave, new way, consider what it means to not just go, but to be a self-sacrificing church that honors God fully. Thank you for listening. I pray that this new journey will be painless, but I would ask that you would partner with Christ and your church to seek creative ways to continue to not only live out our faith, but spread the gospel in new ways. Have a great day.